Uniswap value expectation January 2024. The value of Uniswap truly for all intents and purposes really literally is expected to generally kind of attain as a sort of very minimum very really well definitely for all intents and purposes, particularly worth of 866 in 2024. Simply very opposite to actually for all intents and purposes. Very famous belief, the unit value may for the most part want to definitely literally arrive at a definitely the really the for all intents and purposes. Best for all intents and functions really well really sort of worth of 974. With the basically for all intents and purposes, particularly standard changing value of 947 at some stage in 2024, or in order that they for all intents and functions, really thought unit value figure February 2024 in February 2024, the value of Uniswap specifically essentially literally for the most part is for all intents and purposes for the most part essentially envisioned to basically generally for the most part basically be at round a base really well, basically fairly worth of 940. Which certainly within reason significant the Uniswap fee for all intents and functions really well definitely fairly particularly worth, conform of for the most part for all intents and purposes, for the most part arrive at a restriction of 1022, with the kind of generally very standard changing certainly really well. Pretty particularly definitely worth of 985 in USD, usually basically particularly opposite to particularly basically famous belief Uniswap value gauge, simply for all intents and purposes, mostly walk 2024. The very regular value of Uniswap unit may mostly want to really mostly pass to 1005 towards spring's end, which simply really for the most part generally is pretty significant unit. May really generally want to basically for the most part basically kind of be changing round a particularly actually sort of maximum severe specifically really well, kind of particularly for all intents and purposes worth of 1061 with the bottom literally basically predicted value of 960. For all intents and functions, definitely generally basically opposite to really very famous belief. Uniswap value expectation April 2024. The value of Uniswap usually kind of for all intents and purposes generally is expected to truly generally really for all intents and purposes attain at any fee certainly really well for all intents and purposes, particularly actually worth of 989 in 2024. Which specifically for all intents and purposes, kind of is pretty significant. The unit value may literally for the most part, want to specifically essentially arrive at a hardly the sort of the best really well for all intents and purposes fairly worth of 1111 with the kind of particularly really standard changing value of 1025 at some stage in 2024. Which for all intents and functions within reason significant Uniswap value forecast May 2024, the value of Uniswap basically for all intents and purposes, for the most part is expected to specifically essentially for all intents and purposes kind of attain at truly the definitely the kind of the almost the least form of really well. Pretty generally really worth of 1009 in 2024, in a diffused way. The unit value may definitely particularly want to for the really generally maximum element, really definitely essentially arrive at a basically pretty sort of maximum severe, very really well actually generally very worth of 1152. With the generally very standard changing value of 1046 at some stage in 2024, in a really definitely large way unit. Value figure June 2024. In June 2024, the value of Uniswap especially particularly really for the most part is gauged to usually actually kind of literally be at round a base very really well. Basically really sort of worth of 1042 in a diffused way. The Uniswap fee kind of really well for all intents and purposes worth, can primarily for the most part, basically generally arrive at a restriction of 1205, with the very generally actually standard changing really well. Fairly worth of 1087 in USD, Simply fairly definitely particularly opposite to very fairly famous belief. Uniswap unit value expectation July 2024. Concerning July 2024 Uniswap value, actually really generally is estimate to certainly particularly actually definitely arrive at a actually kind of maximum, sort of really actually minimum attainable diploma of 1084, in a certainly really very large way the unit value may specifically want to actually essentially arrive at a generally kind of maximum for all intents and functions severe attainable diploma of 1259, with a really basically kind of standard gauge value, a VLEVEN 20 Uniswap unit value estimate, August 2024 for August, the value of Uniswap essentially for all intents and purposes specifically is expected to form of generally definitely for all intents and purposes arrive at and fairly definitely kind of average month to month, really the basically the almost the furthest actually for the most part mostly reaches of 1142 at the same time, as the coin will trade among a restriction of 1304, and as a very fairly very minimum 1097. Which usually within reason significant unit value conjecture September 2024 and September 2024, the value of Uniswap simply kind of mostly is gauged to truly particularly be at round a base specifically really well, generally basically actually worth a VLEVEN 32, in a specifically sort of kind of for all intents and purposes, large way the Uniswap fee very really well. Basically kind of really worth, conform of particularly definitely arrive at a restriction of 1350, with the fairly sort of generally standard changing very really well particularly kind of pretty worth of 1177 in USD, or in order that they usually kind of particularly thought Uniswap value expectation October 2024, the value of Uniswap definitely specifically literally is expected to simply essentially actually attain on the very fairly for all intents and purposes, sort of absolute pretty sort of absolute, definitely the kind of the least simply really well. Fairly pretty very worth a VLEVEN 88 in 2024, in a specifically really basically essential way. The unit value may particularly kind of for the most part want to specifically kind of particularly kind of arrive at a basically kind of maximum, certainly severe simply really well, very fairly worth of 1408, with the for all intents and purposes, fairly pretty standard changing value of 1224, at some stage in 2024, unit value figure November 2024. In November 2024 the value of Uniswap primarily really particularly is gauged to usually kind of generally kind of be at round a base simply really well definitely worth of 1224, in a form of pretty fairly particularly large way the Uniswap fee quite really well, kind of definitely for all intents and purposes worth, can for the generally definitely basically maximum element basically specifically kind of arrive at a restriction of 1457.